I want to start out by thanking the jurors and the many sponsoring organizations. This award is an honor. Lillian Smith is someone I've long admired. The principles that she supported, as well as her writing, are something that I've admired for a long time. So it's a great honor. What I want to do over the next 15-20 minutes is just kind of give you a brief overview of my book. And I'm going to show you some pictures because part of what I found about studying the history of traveling Black, this history of how Blacks negotiated various forms of transportation, is that a lot of it is sort of technology that some of you may remember, but others of you may not. And it presented all kinds of spectacles that I really had to dig down and see with my own eyes. So I will start there. So just quickly, Traveling Black explores the intertwined history of travel segregation and Black struggles for freedom of movement, which I found to be really central in African American history. It's organized around the successive forms of transportation adopted by Americans, and it follows the experiences of successive generations of African American travelers as they encounter and resist segregation on everything from stagecoaches and steamships to trains, planes, and automobiles. And one of the many things that fascinated me in trying to kind of reconstruct this experience was just the ways in which African Americans were confronted with new technology, and the ways in which segregation, which we sometimes think as just a sort of ironclad set of rules, was something that had to be adapted to changing technology, and changing social conditions. So my book studies how all of this happens, and as well as how African Americans work systematically to eradicate it. So just a few pictures to get a sense of what I'm talking about. Trains were at the sort of heart of this battle. Um, Discrimination on trains, separate but equal facilities on trains, were what was adjudicated in Plessy versus Ferguson, the famous case that established separate but equal. People sometimes forget it's a railroad case, but what it did was sort of write in stone conditions that had already emerged within the kind of struggles over white supremacy in the late 19th century South, in which Blacks invariably had worse conditions. So up at the top of the picture, you see a Jim Crow car, which was an old wooden car. Sometimes it was also the luggage car and the smoking car. And below you see two different compartments from a 1937 legal case, where the white passengers in the white car are sitting in big sort of plush seats, in an air-conditioned compartment, and the Black passengers are sitting in what's obviously a much older compartment, less clean, less comfortable. And that is sort of in a nutshell what it was, though it could sometimes be much worse than that. Sometimes Jim Crow cars didn't have heat. Sometimes they were lit with fire burning stoves, while white cars had been upgraded to use electric heat to make them less dangerous. And over time, the Jim Crow cars, which tended to be made out of wood rather than metal, because they were older cars, became increasingly dangerous because they were often the only old car on the train. So the Jim Crow car became a sort of grievance that almost symbolized Black second-class citizenship during the early years of the 20th century, and Blacks fought riding in the Jim Crow car, fought the laws that relegated them into it, never quite succeeding. And at the same time, people also were very eager to find other options. The railroad was, for a time, the sort of major way to travel anywhere quickly. But starting in the early 20th century, you begin to get um, other options, most notably the car, which is something that Blacks who can afford to own cars adopt early. One example is the man portrayed here, the boxer Jack Johnson, who was the world's heavyweight champion in 1908. Um, He loved to drive, and at one point owned as many as 8 cars. He was a man of generally swaggering self-confidence whose challenge to white whose mastery of boxing was a challenge to white masculinity, and so too was his mastery of cars. His driving drew all kinds of hostility many places he went. He was often stopped by the police. He received tickets for speeding, reckless driving, obstructing traffic, and other moving violations, which did not discourage him from driving. He once told a Chicago judge that all of his law breaking was simply done for advertising purposes. But it did illustrate one of the challenges that Blacks would face in driving. They would not always be welcome as drivers, and this would grow worse over time. Blacks bought cars, as I said, when they could, and this included not just celebrities like Jack Johnson, but also ordinary people like the sharecroppers who used their cotton picking money on cars, who are pictured here in a sort of Depression era photograph. And Blacks also did their best to make their way onto buses, which developed alongside cars. But all of them would prove somewhat unsatisfactory because with both cars and buses, what you also had developing was a system of roadside accommodations from restaurants to hotels, motels, gas stations, all of which catered mainly to white people. We think of traveling by car, for instance, as private, but it really involves entering a system of automobility where we're dependent on things that sort of make our cars useful to us. And this would become a major problem for Black travelers fairly early on. Um, Early bus lines sometimes refused to carry African American passengers. Both because they regarded them as, not desirable passengers, but also sometimes quite simply because they knew that the rest stops, there was no place that they would not, Blacks would not be permitted to go to the bathroom, would not be permitted to eat. And this could be a problem, not just in the South, but in the North as well sometimes, which made matters worse. One of the things that really puzzled me in researching this book was the extent of retail segregation against Black drivers. I found evidence even, for instance, of gas stations that would not serve Black drivers. They wouldn't sell them gas. And I really spent a long time figuring out why this was, and eventually realized that it was at least partially because um, the sort of network of services that developed around the car, especially things like gas stations, were developed to cater to an increasingly large audience of drivers. And there was a special emphasis on appealing to women, white women, who were seen as a great market. So that's one of the reasons why we have gas stations. Gas was originally sold in hardware stores, but um, they sought to oil companies sought to make the experience more seamless and friendly by developing these kind of homey gas stations. If you look at this picture, you'll see it. The gas station looks sort of like a cottage. This is a model that you can even see today. And this was a goal to appeal to female consumers. Unfortunately, especially in the South, in appealing to white women, many gas station owners kind of saw that certain other people were unwelcome at their gas stations. And this was what led to the blocking of Black passengers in some gas stations in the South and a few in the North. So all of this meant that even with the development of a possibly slightly better form of transportation, things were still often closed off to African Americans. Um, you see that in some of these guides that you guys may have heard of in recent years, such as the Green Book. These guides were really designed to allow Black drivers to negotiate this often unfriendly retail atmosphere. Um, they had specific information about where you could stay, where you could um, where you could eat, where you could get your car serviced. And many people testified that they were really sort of crucial to traveling successfully. But I also found that some drivers who used them ended up being dissatisfied. They were not always up to date. They did not really save people from all the potential dangers. Their ads were in part advertising, and you couldn't entirely rely on them or entirely make good choices from them. So they didn't entirely eliminate what over time grew to be the worst of what Black drivers faced, which was kind of uncertainty about where they could stop and stay, how they would be treated in particular places. And Blacks instead often kind of relied on a kind of more informal network, talking to people who had traveled places and otherwise hope for the best. The best was not always what they got, and the book tells a lot of stories of sort of journeys went awry. And unfortunately, this could happen in the air as well. This image is a sort of early imagining of how Jim Crow might move itself to the air. It comes out at a time before anything like commercial flight. But it kind of shows you how the segregation of transportation has sort of firmly fixed itself in the imagination of Americans, and also people abroad. I think Puck is a British publication. Um, and this intrigued me, and so did the whole subject of flying while Black, since I hadn't read anything about it, and wasn't quite sure I could write about it. But when I did research, I did find that there was, in fact, a variety of forms of segregation and discrimination people experienced in the air. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. People would people were initially Blacks who wanted to fly were initially sometimes blocked from flying. Subsequently, by the 1940s, a segregated seating system evolved in which Black passengers were often relegated to particular seats. Um, and while that was challenged in the courts in the early 50s, Black passengers also encountered all kinds of forms of segregation on the ground. Ella Fitzgerald, for instance, was bumped off a plane in Hawaii. Blacks were often the first in line for kind of disruptions while flying. And while it might seem enjoyable to be stuck in Honolulu, she actually missed her concert in Australia and ended up suing and winning after this experience. For most Black passengers, these kind of disruptions were not something that they sued over, and they were also could be terribly inconvenient because there were many airports that did not have any restaurant facilities for Black passengers, especially in the South. So people who got stuck in the airport could be very, very uncomfortable. They also had things like colored restrooms, which you can kind of see. It's a little bit dim in the right corner of that, right in front of the car rental signs. You see the colored restroom signs. All of these things would last right until the early 60s, when the Freedom Rides of 1961 put pressure on the Kennedy administration to finally put an end to segregation on buses, and trains and in airports. And the Kennedy administration took it up in a very serious way with the airports, many of which were federally funded. At that time, you also had freedom flights, which many people are unfamiliar with, but this is one from a group of ministers who were returning from the freedom rides and decided to challenge segregation within the airport at Tallahassee. So all of this, the book documents how this all comes to an end and the struggles required to end it, which were not just in the courts, but also often on the ground. There was sort of a sustained battle against segregation on transportation that basically lasted as long as those forms of transportation exist. I end by asking people to really think about the ways in which segregation and discrimination on transportation is really entirely gone. We live now in a much more car-centric society than those previous generations that fought segregation on buses and trains. And as a result, we still have considerable inequities around transportation. Um, and they have to do with exactly how driving and roads are shaped in our country. Blacks tend to experience um, discrimination at almost every level of car buying and car ownership. Blacks and Hispanics are most numerous among people who don't own cars in the United States and experience negative consequences of that, especially in circumstances like the natural disaster that took place in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. There was no real provision made for people who didn't have cars, and as a result, most of the people left behind in New Orleans were Black. And then, of course, we have the sort of constant shame of our day, things like police stops, which again tend to target some people more than others. So I would just close by emphasizing that transportation remains a real site of inequities in our society. It's a sometimes invisible thing, especially for those who don't experience those difficulties, but it's something to think about as you move around the world. Thank you very much.